All right, hi everyone, and thanks for joining us for this session on Octant. So just a quick introduction. My name is Mark Foley. I'm a VMware Senior Systems Engineer. I'm based in Brisbane, Australia. It's actually a beautiful morning here. I wish I could share it with you, but like many of you, I am in lockdown and I have some grumpy teenagers and very stressed household animals around. So I think the virtual background's a good way to avoid any distractions. So just a little bit about me. I have been at VMware for a little bit over 2 years now. Prior to that, I worked at a number of other large software companies for quite a few years, and I actually started off life as a software developer. So this session on Octant is actually something that's quite near and dear to my heart. Now, this is something a little bit different for me. I spend a lot of time talking to VMware customers about VMware products, and strictly speaking, Octant is not actually a VMware product. What it is a VMware-backed open source project. And often when I talk to people about VMware and open source, they're actually very surprised that VMware, the degree to which VMware contributes to open source. And sorry, get that slide going. VMware's now very, very active in open source, and that's been growing a lot, certainly over time that I've been at VMware. And certainly if you're a Kubernetes developer, one of the things you should be aware of is just the level of contribution that VMware makes. In fact, in the last quarter, we were number 2 contributor to the Kubernetes project, and there's several projects that are backed by VMware that are very significant in that cloud-native computing foundation ecosystem. So things like Harbor and Sonaboy, they're probably very relevant to you. Over today, what we're going to talk about is Octant, which is probably one of the newest open source initiatives that we've embarked on. And as I mentioned before, Octant's a tool for developers. And what we want to do today is I'll probably spend most of the time in a live demo of Octant. There you go. I've said the words live demo, so if everyone cross their fingers, that'd be great. Hopefully the demo gods are with us today. Before I start that live demo, what I want to do is quickly just cover off what Octant is and is not. So basically from the Octant website, the sentence at the top, Octant's a tool for developers to understand how applications run on a Kubernetes cluster. And effectively, the key there is understand how applications run on a Kubernetes cluster. It basically provides you with visualization as to what your application is doing and how it's interacting with that cluster. So it's very developer-centric, but it's probably relevant for other roles as well. If you're an SRE or a tester, I can see some use for it. In terms of the background that you probably need to have to understand this session, you really need to have some knowledge of those key Kubernetes construction objects. So things like pods, deployments, replica sets, services, that type of thing. And also use of kube control to deploy and manage workloads. One of the things I do want to point out about the role of Octant is very definitely not a kube control replacement. It will do some of the things that kube control does, but primarily it's around visualization and providing a few convenience methods and tools. So it's really more about aiding your comprehension. You're still going to need to be familiar with kube control. And this is really how I got into Octant. I've done development for quite a long time, 20 plus years, but I'm fairly new to Kubernetes. So I found Octant really, really useful about 6 months ago when I started to try and get my head around Kubernetes and just understand how it works. So I'm really, really good for that. And just as my level of experience has grown, I still find it very useful for understanding what is going on. So as I say, not a kube control replacement. It's also not a dashboard or a production tool. So some of the things it does might look a little bit like that, but there are some security issues with it that I'll take you through when we get into the demo. I mean, you really need to be very, very careful in running it in any type of production environment. As I said, it's very new as well. So I think it's a little bit over a year old now, and currently it's a version 0.11. Don't let that 0.11 put you off. It's actually very feature rich. You might find the odd little niggle in terms of bugs and things like that. I haven't seen too many though. It's actually remarkably solid for a very early release product. So I really do find it works very well. So, look, that's the slides. I really want to get into the demo now and just actually walk you through the process of installing and configuring and actually using Octant and walking through a sort of simple scenario. And that's going to be the bulk of the presentation today. I should point out, if there are any questions, you can enter those into the YouTube interface. I won't see those live, but when we get to the end, I'll have one of my colleagues read those out to me, and we can address those as we go through. Right, so let's get started and start off first things first and look at how we get Octant installed. So what you're going to want to do is go and have a look at the Octant website. So that's octant.dev, and it'll walk you through the installation process. And there's a couple of things to point out here about Octant and how it's installed. First thing, it is a client-side tool only. So it gets installed on your developer workstation. There is absolutely nothing that needs to be installed, configured, or changed on the cluster. It will basically interact with your Kubernetes cluster in exactly the same way that kubectl does, using the public APIs. In terms of the install packages, they are available for Linux, Windows, and Mac at the moment. You can either download a binary or do what I do, which is actually use a package manager. So what I'm going to do is just go in and use Homebrew to install Octant. Right, so while it's going on, just a brief talk about sorry, I'm just getting a message there that I need to reshare my screen. So let me just go and reshare the screen there. Stop share and reshare. Okay. So great. Excellent. All right. Sorry about that, everyone. Just a sort of technical difficulty there. So I hope you can see my screen. You should be able to see my web browser and also my terminal at the moment. So looks like we're back on. So let me get back in there and get this install going. Right, so while it's installing, I just want to talk a little bit about how Octant gets configured to talk to your clusters. And basically, it works in exactly the same way that kubectl does. So what it will do is it will look for a kubeconfig file, and it'll either go and look for that in a default location, or if you have a kubeconfig environment variable set, it will use that. So it's very important that you have that kubeconfig file available, and there are some valid context in there. So if that's not set up properly, then Octant's not going to work and not be able to connect to any of your clusters. So it's great, right? We're now up and running, and Octant is installed. And the way I'm going to start it, just from the command line, Octant. At the moment, I'm not going to use any command line parameters or anything. I'm just going to kick it off, and most of the time, that's all you'll need to do. So it will start, and by default, when we start it, it's just going to launch into my default browser. And that's it, right? We're now looking at the user interface for Octant. Now, before we get into the capabilities and what it can do for you, there's a couple of things I want to point out that you might have some issues with, and then also take you through some resolutions for that. So as I said, the first thing to be aware of is it will get the information on your clusters and how to connect to your clusters from the kubeconfig file. And basically, you can see on the top right-hand corner here, a list of the context that are available in your kubeconfig file. Mine's fairly clean at the moment. I cleaned it out especially for this, but if you've come in about a week ago, you would have seen all sorts of contexts, and half of them weren't working. So if you have contexts that don't work, either the cluster doesn't exist anymore, or there's issues with the identities in there, that can cause you issues with Octant. So you just need to be aware of that. The other thing you need to be aware of is that most of Octant is concerned with what is going on in the namespaces, so the workloads you have running in the namespaces. But if we just scroll down in the tree view here, you'll notice you also have cluster overview area. which is basically providing you information on the cluster as a whole. So things like the nodes that are in there, the persistent volumes, things like that. If you're working in a shared developer environment, what you may find is that your context might not give you permissions to look at this cluster level information. So that may cause you an issue when you're running Octant. So the way we get around these issues is there's quite a few different command line options for Octant, and if we just go help, let's see what they are. So a couple of things to be aware of, right? One of the things we can do is we can specify the context that we launch into. So if you hit context in your kubeconfig that either don't have permissions or are no longer valid, if you launch into one of those, it's going to cause you problems. So what you might want to do is specify a particular context to launch into. The next one is the disable cluster overview switch. So what that will do is turn off this cluster overview area. It's going to prevent Octant making those API calls that you might not have permissions for. So there are a couple of things you might need to do just to get it initially working. The last quick thing I want to point out is notice when I started Octant, it just literally it started up, it launched my web page, and that was it. There's no security prompt, there's no password, no nothing, right? So right away, just by starting Octant, you've published information about your cluster for anyone who can access your IP address. As you'll see when we go through Octant, you also have the ability to delete and change and modify workload. So not really the sort of thing you want to be doing on a production server. So just bear in mind, one of the things we can do is there is an option there to specify a list of accepted hosts to prevent who can come in to this Octant interface. But even so, I'd still be a little bit leery about using this. So as I said, my earlier warning, be very careful about using this on a production environment. In fact, I probably wouldn't. Okay, so look, that's pretty straightforward, right? We're up, running, and we have the Octant user interface open and working, and we're able to start using it. So let's start going through and seeing what exactly we can do with Octant. And when we look at Octant, we basically have, just screen's a little bit cluttered here. There's basically a few key areas there. So as I said earlier, we have the cluster overview, just general information about the cluster. We have the overview tree, which is basically listing out all of the different objects that are in our namespace that we've chosen. So notice at the top here, we can select a different namespace to be in our particular context. So as I say, we have all the different objects there. And then we have this workload view. So the workload view is probably the simplest, so I might start with that. So the way to think of the workload view is it's like a pod-centric view of all your workloads. The workload view lists out all of the pods that are in my environment and just gives me a traffic light view as to the health of those pods. Now this particular namespace is not that interesting, so let me go to one where I know there's going to be a few problems. Okay, so here's one that's a little bit more interesting, right? So we have a few pods there that are sitting in orange. And what I can do is I just have this nice visualization of all the pods running in my namespace. I can see there might be problems with some of them. So what I'm able to do is drill down into what we call a resource overview. And you'll see this particular screen and a few other areas of Octant. So this tells us we've got our pod. We can also see that this pod is actually associated with a job, which is part of our batch job. And just excuse that little moving around of all the icons. It's one of the little winkles I told you about earlier. Doesn't usually happen, but for some reason we're getting it at the moment. So we can see the pod and we can see all the different objects and constructs associated with the pod at the moment. We can also go click on these and we get a summary of those objects on the right-hand side, and notice that they're hot links. So we can actually drill down into that batch job or the cron job if we need to. Let's say that workload area, good sort of first port of call, what's running in my namespace, what's the health of it, and what are the different objects and constructs that make up that particular application. However, with Octant, what you're probably going to find is you're going to spend most of your time in this overview area. And as I said, that's got the list of all the different objects in that are running in my environment. And if I click on any part of that tree, what it's going to do is it'll bring up all of the different child elements. So I click on the overview area, and I can basically see all the objects in this particular namespace listed out. A list for each type of object, some information about that object, and all of it there available to me, and I can drill down on that if I need to. You'll also notice down the bottom we have a list of events, right? So those are the events that have been occurring in this particular namespace, and we can drill down and explore those as well if we want to. So what I want to do is just look and drill down onto some. I'm not going to go through all of these different object types. Obviously, we're all a little bit different. They all have different properties and methods and tools associated with them, but there's certainly commonality there. So what I'm going to do is actually go back to my default namespace and just use a service object as an example. So click on my services. List of services sitting in my namespace, and then I'm going to go and look at my front-end service. And as I say, this is a pretty good summary of what you find in that Octant, the sort of information that Octant provides you for most of the objects in your namespace. We typically will have a configuration area, just details of the configuration of that object. We'll have a status, current status, so it's a service, so it's pretty simple. And then in this case, we've also got what are the endpoints associated with the service. The other thing you'll notice is quite common. We might have some editing functionality. So if I click on edit for the service, one of the things we're able to do is change the selectors on the service. I'm not going to change that now because that's going to stop that working, and we're going to need that later on. So different objects might have different editing or modification capabilities. Let's cancel out of that. The other thing I should point out too is pretty much all the objects will have a delete option as well. So we can actually go in here and delete that object. Again, what I mentioned about security, probably one of the reasons you don't want to have this running on a production environment. In these 4 tabs across the top, you'll find at least this on all of the different object types. So any metadata that might be associated with the object. Again, the resource viewer, right? So just another way to get access to that resource viewer and just see what the relationship is between the object we're looking at, which is the service, and then all the other associated objects. So I find this view really useful. It's just a great way to understand how things hang together. And if I click on those other objects, again, I can drill down and see what the status of them is. The other thing you can always see with an object is its YAML definition. Now, at the moment in Octant, the YAML is not editable, and in fact, this is one of the things on the roadmap. So certainly for me, this is one of my top wish list items. But at some point, you will actually be able to go in and edit the YAML, just not quite yet. So as I say, that sort of type of structure and the information that you get with the service is pretty typical of all those different object types in Octant. What I want to do now, though, is just talk through some of the more complex object types and some of the more commonly used one, and just show you, illustrate that by walking through a typical sort of development scenario. So if I go back to my workflows here, and what you'll see is this in the default workspace, I've got a fairly simple e-commerce demonstration app that I'm working on at the moment. And one of the things I want to do is actually deploy a new version of the cart deployment. So to better illustrate what's going on, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the label. And what that will do is it'll apply a filter. So now we have a filter applied to my environment, and I'm only seeing objects with that label applied to them. That's quite a nice way of just drilling down and seeing exactly what's going on. What I want to do now is go into that cart, and I'm going to delete it because I'm about to put a new one in. So that's kicked off the delete process, and if we want, we can basically follow that process through the Octant UI, and you'll notice that the available replicas has already gone to 0, and it's gradually cleaning up the environment. So let's go back to the deployments. Right. And pretty soon what you'll see is that will probably disappear. Anyway, while that's working through, what I'm going to do is go back to my terminal and I'm going to deploy that new version of the cart deployment. So look there, there's my YAML file, great, so that's good. So let's go in and do that. Right, so you'll notice in the Octant interface that now the deployment's gone. We don't have anything in there, so the deletion has finally been processed. And then I go through and do that deployment, done, right? And it's one of the things I really like about Octant, almost instant feedback. So do the deployment, as soon as the deployment happened, that's reflected back in the user interface. And now what I can do is go into that cart deployment and have a look and see what's going on. So as I said earlier, it's a pretty common pattern in Octant. You'll see a configuration area and a status area, but a deployment's a much more complex object than a service. So as you'd expect, there's quite a lot more that's showing in here. So we can see the list of pods associated with that deployment. We can see the conditions associated with the replica set associated with that deployment. So we notice that availability is false because we haven't finished deploying yet. We can also see the pod environment. So you'll notice the image is shown here, as well as the environment that's set for that particular pod. We can also see that the Redis pass environment variable is set to the value of a secret, and if we want to, we can drill down into that secret and examine it. So really nice way of bringing all that information about a deployment together and showing it in a nice user-friendly way. Now, as I say, and finally down the bottom, we have the events that are occurring for that particular deployment. So that's all good, and we can go back to the top again and just see how our deployment's progressing. And as we can see, probably not great. We still don't have any available replicas, and it seems to be a bit slower than it should be. So what we might want to do is drill down into the pod and try and see what's going on. So let's go and open that up. And we can see it's pending, right? So still hasn't deployed and it's taking a while. And what I want to do is just go down to the bottom and just have a look at the events that are occurring there. And that looks like it's my issue right there, right? So can't pull the image. If I look at that image name, I notice I have fat finger the name and I have put 2 T's in cart. So that's something I need to fix. Now, how do I fix it? Well, I obviously go back and edit the YAML, or what I can do is basically go back to the deployment spec and just go in and edit my pod template and change the name of that. And bang, that's been done right away. And what you'll see is that that shouldn't take too long. Great, yep, done. Right, so we can see minimum replicas available is true. So our pod's deployed. We have 1 replica available and we're running. So I managed to fix that issue. So that's great, right? I've actually got my container at least running in Kubernetes. The next question though is what's going on inside that container? And again, this is where Octant can help. So what we can do is drill down into that pod and we can go have a look at the logs. Right? So notice that if we have a pod with multiple containers, we're able to select the different containers in the pod to see the different log screens. We can also apply a filter if we need to go and search for elements in the logs. And we also have the ability to display or not display a timestamp. So a nice, easy way to, get that access to the logs. Now that we're looking at the logs, we actually see there's an issue occurring, right? For some reason that pod is that container is unable to see Redis. So what we can now do is go and bring up a terminal for that container. I can then go and just use it like any other shell, have a look around, see if I can run Redis. Okay, well that's obviously my issue, right? So again, very, very convenient. One of the things I should point out though is for that terminal, option to work, you do need to have a shell installed in your container, and that might not always be the case if you've stripped down a container for production and it's nice and lightweight. You're not necessarily going to be able to run a terminal in there, so be aware that's probably an area that not always going to work as well as possible. So that's quite good, right? We've been able to debug any deployment problems. Once the container's running, we've been able to use the logs of the terminal to get a bit of an idea of what's happening in there. There's a few other tools that you should be aware of as well, though. So let's go back to the summary. Actually, let's go to another pod, something a little bit more interesting. I'm going to go to my front end pod and just clear my filter. Right, and let's go to the application front end. Okay, so we see the pod there. That's all great. Now I want to see if my front end's working, and one of the things I haven't done is I haven't configured any ingress controllers in this particular cluster. So I'm just going to want to do it quick and dirty way and basically go start a port forward. And so again, that's something I can do directly from the user interface. Over that. Trouble with these smart mouse. You touch them the wrong way and they the back arrow for you. Okay, so there we go. So we've got that port forward started now, and then I can just simply click on the link and away we go, right? So that port could be a database port, it could be a debugger port. In this case, it just happens to be the front end port. So it's nothing you can't do with kube control, but for me, I can never remember the syntax for this. So really nice, easy, accessible way to get access to that functionality. That's just about all I wanted to talk about in terms of the overview area and all the different objects. I just wanted to make you aware of a couple of other pieces of functionality in there. So as I mentioned, I'm not going to go through all the different object types in here, but different object types, Octant exposes different levels of functionality. So for example, if you are debugging a cron job, one of the things you want to be able to do is trigger those cron jobs on demand. And again, that's one of the capabilities we have in Octant. We can go in and see our cron jobs and just execute the trigger. Again, a nice little helper tool in there that just very easy to access, and I find quite useful if I'm working with those cron jobs. So hopefully that gives you a good feel for the main areas of functionality of Octant. You should have a flavor now for the fact that it's really all about visualization. I find it useful in development. I also find it useful when I'm exploring areas of Kubernetes I'm not familiar with. One of the things I'm pretty new to is just Kubernetes security. So the other day I was reading some articles on security, and while I'm doing it, I'm actually able to basically explore the default roles and role bindings in my environment as I do it, and I find that quite helpful. So I can go in, I can look at what those cluster roles are, see how they're configured, look at the rules associated with them. So I'd say just that visualization, bringing all that information together, it's great for that and great for helping you understand your applications and Kubernetes in general. So before I finish off with a live demo, just one other area I want to point out, and that is the fact that like Kubernetes itself, Octant is very extensible, and there's a comprehensive plugin architecture that's available for Octant. There aren't too many plugins available at the moment. The ones I'm aware of is like a demonstration Helm plugin, and there's also a plugin for Antria, which is again a VMware-backed open source container networking solution. But you should keep an eye on the plugins because I expect to see more of them over time as Octant matures. And I saw someone demonstrate the Antria plugin the other day, and great, right? It just if you're extending Kubernetes, you want to extend Octant as well and get that visibility of that custom definition that's been added into the environment. So look, that's pretty much all I wanted to cover today in terms of the live demo. So let me just head back to the presentation and just a bit of a sum up. the one message to you is, look, just try it. As you've seen, really easy to get up and running with Octant. The installation takes, you can be up and running in a minute. Very intuitive, and it's evolving very rapidly as well. So there's a very active bunch of developers on it. So expect to see more and more features over time. If you're interested in the roadmap, I have a link to the roadmap there as well. If you have any questions, and if there's any questions through the seminar, I'll ask Kripa to start reading them out now. But also feel free to contact me as well, and I'm happy to answer any questions via email. But let me just bring up the chat window and see what we're there. Oh, great, no questions so far. So, look, thank you for your time, everyone. Much appreciated. I hope you found this session useful. And as I say, if you get the chance, please download, install, and use Octant. I think you'll find it great. Thank you.